Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's jump right in because today we are doing something absolutely thrilling. We're taking a massive step back to look at the big picture. We're talking about the vast, magnificent tapestry of science. We're going to see how all of its individual threads, the microscopic, the cosmic, the structural, and the physical, actually weave together into one unified understanding of our entire universe.
But to get us started, I want to pose a quick question. How do you actually understand a forest? I mean, really think about it. A natural system like a forest is incredibly complex, it's highly dynamic, and it's just constantly changing. If you want to truly figure out how the whole thing works, where do you even begin?
Well, if we break it down, it's fascinating to see how different experts approach that exact same patch of woods. A biologist, right? They walk into the forest and they see the organisms. They're looking at the trees, the fungi, the birds, and how they all mesh into this complex ecosystem. But a chemist, they're analyzing the molecules cycling through the dirt and the microscopic reactions of photosynthesis happening inside every single leaf. An earth scientist is looking down at the bedrock, the weathering processes creating that soil, and the global climate patterns dictating the rain. And then you have the physicist. They're measuring the energy flowing from the sunlight, the structural forces holding a massive towering trunk upright against the wind, and the electromagnetic waves that literally let us photograph the whole thing from space. They're all looking at the exact same forest, but through completely different yet entirely essential lenses.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with number 1, the 4 branches of science. Then we'll trace the individual journeys of 2, life, cells to ecosystems, 3, Earth, interior to cosmos, 4, chemistry, atoms to molecules, and 5, physics, motion to electromagnetism. And finally, for our grand finale, we'll dive into number 6, where the branches meet.
All right, section 1, the 4 branches of science. Because, before we can really appreciate the entire tapestry, we first need to isolate and understand each individual thread. And this brilliantly hits the nail on the head regarding our core thesis today. As the source material puts it, no single branch can explain the forest by itself. To truly understand any natural system, you need all 4 branches of science working together. Definitely keep that in mind as we journey through these disciplines. Moving right along to section 2, life from cells to ecosystems. Let's pull on that biological thread first. This is a journey that scales all the way from the microscopic up to the global. Tracing the progression of life science is basically a story of increasing complexity and connection. It starts at the absolute smallest scale of living organization, the cell, with its selectively permeable membranes and endless division. From there, we zoom out, right? We see how cells build tissues, then organs, and then entirely functioning organisms running on these intricate feedback loops. We then look at the energy that powers them, that underlying genetic DNA code that acts as their instruction manual, and how that genetic variation actually drives evolution and natural selection over vast stretches of time. And finally, ecology, how all these evolving organisms interact with each other and their environment. You literally cannot understand ecology without evolution, or evolution without genetics. Each step builds so precisely on the last.
Now, what's really mind-blowing here is how these ultimate energy engines of life work. Photosynthesis steps up, captures solar energy, and locks it safely away in glucose. Then, cellular respiration comes in and releases that stored energy to actually power the cell. They are perfectly complementary. The products of one, glucose and oxygen, are the exact reactants of the other. It's just this continuous, beautiful cycle of energy transformation that sustains pretty much all life on Earth. Let's move to section 3, Earth, from the interior out to the cosmos. We're shifting gears to Earth science, which dramatically expands our scale. While biology scaled up in complexity, the progression of Earth science scales up geographically. We start way, way down deep in Earth's interior, looking at the inner core and the magnetic field. Then, we move up to the surface to see how things like continental drift and plate tectonics literally build our mountains and oceans. We look up into the atmosphere to understand wild weather patterns and the greenhouse effect. We span outward across the oceans, mapping out the currents that transport massive amounts of heat. And then, we leave the planet entirely. We study astronomy, the solar system, the birth and death of stars. Finally, we bring it all back down to Earth with climate science. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that none of these geographic zones operate in a vacuum. They form what we call a unified Earth system model. The immense interior heat of the planet is what drives the plate tectonics. Those shifting plates physically shape the surface. The surface and those vast oceans are just constantly exchanging heat with the atmosphere above.
And out in space, the sun is powering this entire system. Climate science is what ultimately pulls all these disparate geographic systems together into one deeply interconnected web.
Which brings us to Section 4, chemistry, from atoms to molecules. This is the ultimate structural foundation that builds matter from the absolute ground up. The progression here is purely structural. You start by peering inside the atom itself, at the protons, neutrons, and electron clouds. Then you neatly organize all those elements into the periodic table. Once you've got the elements, you can see how they connect through chemical bonds. And it's those static bonds that then allow us to understand the crazy dynamic chemical reactions and equations. We move on to how substances mix together in solutions, diving into acids and bases. And finally, we arrive at carbon, the magical element that forms the long chains and rings that literally underpin all known life in biochemistry. You simply cannot understand a dynamic, explosive reaction without first getting to know the static atoms and bonds that make it up.
And why do atoms even bother bonding in the first place? Well, they do it to achieve stable electron configurations. They want to be stable. And there are two main ways they pull this off. Ionic bonds, where electrons are completely transferred, handed over, between metals and nonmetals. And covalent bonds, where electrons are actually shared between nonmetals. This simple, fundamental drive for stability is the core driving force behind absolutely all the chemical transformations in the universe.
On to Section 5, physics, from motion to electromagnetism. Here we introduce our fourth and final thread, the universal rules governing energy and movement. Physics takes us on this wild conceptual journey. We start out just simply describing motion using kinematics, speed, velocity, acceleration. But then we ask why things move using Newton's laws of forces. We connect those forces to work and energy. We see how energy can actually travel through empty space without transporting any matter, in the form of waves like sound and light. We explore the flow of electric charge through circuits, and it all culminates in electromagnetism, unifying electricity and magnetism once and for all, proving that moving charges create magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields induce electric currents. It all comes down to some incredibly elegant formulas. This is literally the mathematical language of the physical world. Velocity is simply distance over time. Net force equals mass times acceleration. Work equals force times distance. Wave velocity equals wavelength times frequency. With just these few concise equations, you can quantify almost everything in the physical world. We're talking everything from a car driving down your street, all the way to the light from a distant, ancient star crossing the immense vacuum of the universe.
And finally, Section 6, where the branches meet. We've reached the climax of our explainer. We've isolated our four threads. Now let's see what happens when we finally weave them all back together into a single tapestry.
This brings us to arguably the most profound insight of modern science. The divisions we just walked through, biology, earth science, chemistry, physics, they are ultimately artificial boundaries. Sure, they are incredibly useful for organizing a high school textbook or figuring out university departments, but they do not reflect how nature actually works. In the real world out there, every single system involves multiple branches simultaneously. Let me prove this to you by deconstructing something as mundane as a single green leaf. Walk through this with me. First, biology explains the cellular structure, the chloroplasts, and the genetic instructions shaping that exact leaf. Second, chemistry steps in to describe the precise molecular reactions of photosynthesis, breaking and forming bonds to turn CO2 and water into glucose. Third, physics quantifies the electromagnetic radiation, the sunlight, that powers this whole incredible process and measures the energy stored in those newly formed chemical bonds. And fourth, earth science explains the atmospheric CO2 concentration, the local climate conditions that even allow the tree to survive, and the specific soil minerals providing its nutrients. All four disciplines operating in perfect, seamless harmony in one tiny object. So a leaf isn't just biology. No way. A leaf is biology, chemistry, physics, and earth science all at once, all the time. True scientific understanding requires us to tear down those artificial textbook walls and fully embrace this deeply interdisciplinary approach. You just cannot understand the whole without seeing how all the individual parts interact. I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge today. Take a quick look around the room you're in right now. Choose an everyday object or system. Maybe it's a glass of water sitting on your desk, maybe a thunderstorm's rolling in outside, or even just the smartphone right there in your pocket. Try to deconstruct it the exact same way we just deconstructed that leaf. Ask yourself, how do physics, chemistry, biology, and earth science all contribute to making that object exist? Which branch do you think contributes the most? Or, as you might start to realize, are they all fundamentally, beautifully, and equally important? Think deeply about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring those connections.